Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming. I know there's a lot of choices at Ipsc, including a concert apparently, so I feel very lucky that you guys are here. This afternoon I'd like to present what I think is a really interesting series of events that have been taking place in the music publishing industry. And that I think present a really fascinating case study at the intersection of antitrust, copyright, and regulation. The background to really understand how these things are happening is quite complicated, and a lot of the legal structure behind music licensing is silly. So I'm going to err on the side of oversimplification in order to get to the really interesting stuff today. But I do have a draft, so if you find any of this interesting and you want to dig into more of the details, I'm happy to pass that along. So I apologize in advance for brushing over some of the details. The events that I'm going to present today challenge our conventional notions, conventional thinking about regulation as inherently anti-competitive. We often think of regulation as something that naturally closes off markets and protects incumbents. Today I'm going to suggest that in a market that lacks structural competition, like the music publishing industry, regulation can actually have the opposite effect. It can actually work to open up the markets, to maintain competition. It has some sort of counterintuitive work in that direction as well. So the series of events that really got me interested in this began at the beginning of last year. At the beginning of 2014, two out of the nation's three major music publishers, Sony and Universal, attempted to, and did for a time, withdraw their digital rights. And when I say digital rights, I'm referring to these public performance rights for musical compositions. Doesn't matter, but a specific type of right on the digital side, not the analog side, and I'll talk a bit about that distinction in a minute. So they wanted to withdraw their digital rights from ASCAP, which is the name of this collective organization that for the last century or so has handled the administration and collection of royalties for these types of rights, and go into the market, engage in private ordering, private negotiation, and come up with their own rate. And they did this. They went into the market and they negotiated with Pandora, one of the largest and most successful streaming music services, and they got a rate. They secured a rate, Universal did, nearly 2 times the rate that ASCAP was securing for the same rights in the market. So a couple of interesting things about this. First, this was the first time that we'd seen music publishers attempting to withdraw their rights from the collectives and license them themselves. Digital rights only. This is important, as I'll explain in a minute. After all, the collectives have always been justified on the basis of their ability to minimize transaction costs, to consolidate bargaining power. So it seems counterintuitive that they want to give all of that up and do all of the work themselves in the market. They also didn't have to. I think this is pretty important. The assignment of rights to ASCAP is not exclusive. Sony and Universal could have additionally licensed their own rights or done just a deal with one entity while leaving their digital rights in to deal with all the other entities. And importantly also, at the beginning of this process, ASCAP's governing documents didn't allow for this. They didn't allow for partial withdrawals. You certainly are under no obligation to belong to a collective, but if you were all in. Okay, so we have ASCAP, which is supposed to be this transaction cost minimizing, bargaining power consolidating mechanism. It has all this institutional knowledge in place. So as I said, we might wonder, well, why are Sony and Universal, these two huge music publishers, together controlling approximately 60% of the market, looking to withdraw and do all this work themselves? As I mentioned, in the short and overly simplified explanation, well, they got 2 times the rate they were getting under ASCAP, right? So that seems fairly straightforward. I've written a bit before about how private ordering, in addition, allows a lot more flexibility, a lot more tailoring of terms. But certainly, doubling the rate is pretty good motivation here in any event. A couple of thoughts on that. First, we could view this doubling of the rate as just the free market economics in action, right? So it basically could be that because ASCAP is trying to respond to the needs of very differently situated members, and because it's operating under these consent decrees, the ASCAP and BMI and some of the collective agency have both operated under consent decrees since the 1940s. So because of these constraints, then it was probably not able to charge a market optimal price, and so this was just sort of fixing that rate. An alternate view could be that this is actually leading to a bit of pathological private ordering. That's the position that I take in this paper for the most part, and I say pathological because we saw the negotiations between Sony and Universal and Pandora, that there was a lot of behavior, and I detail this extensively in the paper, that amounts to what we would call parallel pricing and tacit collusion. And I'll define those in a second. Of course, the question could be, that I usually first get is, well, okay, so they got double the rate, why didn't they just do this before? I think that can be explained in large part by the transition from analog to digital, right? It made a lot more sense. There was a lot more call for the collectives in an analog world. So it's hard for content owners to go to every restaurant and every bar, listen for the song, how many times it was played, invoice it, and then enforce on those invoices. On the digital side, it's actually a pretty straightforward process to know exactly what Pandora played and how many times it played it. Those kinds of things can be done in-house. So I think the move from digital to analog is probably a big impetus. Also, as I mentioned, we had ASCAPs and governing documents that didn't allow for this kind of withdrawal anyway. So there had to be a sufficient impetus to have them want to get these documents amended in the first place. And actually 2 separate amendments to the governing documents to get it to where they could withdraw those things. So ultimately, after Sony and Universal negotiated this rate, 2 times ASCAP's rate, Pandora took the case to the rate court. For these types of rates, the Southern District of New York has been assigned as a rate court if a prospective licensee can't agree with ASCAP to a rate. They can ask the rate court to set it. In this case, Pandora was not only complaining about the rate, but also complaining about the partial withdrawals. And the rate court sided with Pandora and determined, in fact, the ASCAP's governing documents, but more importantly, the consent decree under which ASCAP operates does not allow for partial withdrawals. And the Second Circuit confirmed that, and the DOJ has since also issued its confirmation that they don't intend, under the consent decrees, to allow for partial withdrawal. Which means that now we're at a point where the major publishers, if they want to handle their own digital rights, have to withdraw in full. And this doesn't bode well for ASCAP, right, who wanted to allow partial withdrawals in the first place so they could retain what revenues they could. Also doesn't bode particularly well for the publishers who want to be able to exercise their market power in getting these rates, but also don't want to be stuck monitoring every bar and restaurant and retail clothing store. So why should we care about this? Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but some of the big ones that I'd like to focus on. First is the potential for this anti-competitive behavior that I'm going to get to in a second here, the parallel pricing and the tacit collusion, to stifle innovation in the distribution space. It's notable that when Sony and Universal first withdrew their digital rights, they went directly to the strongest and most prevalent streaming service. Makes sense as a bargaining partner, but also doesn't particularly encourage new entrants into that particular market, doesn't encourage them to work particularly hard to exceed Pandora and put themselves in the position of potentially being a target for this type of abusive behavior. The governing ASCAP, the amendment of ASCAP's governing documents also suggests there could be some problems with cutting out artists. Like Section 114G2, which is a section of the copyright laws that guarantees a cut of royalties incoming to artists, ASCAP's governing documents had similar clauses. Of course, once you're not operating under ASCAP's governing documents, we don't get this guaranteed payout to artists. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for the purposes of this paper, we've got this anti-competitive behavior problem, right? So I mentioned parallel pricing, which is different than actually collusive pricing, because this is where you have 2 similarly situated entities in a close market. Again, I told you we have 3 total major publishers here who can simply observe each other's behavior and note that if I don't lower my price and you don't lower your price, we'll be able to stay here. If you charge a little more, I can charge a little more. So this is this sort of gray area that we call parallel pricing. And tacit collusion, which is a phrasing I'm using to distinguish it from explicit collusion. Although, if you read the rate court's decision, you might argue that some of those emails get very, very close to explicit collusion. But the idea being that there's more of a tacit agreement that we're going to keep the rate high on Pandora. That's something that was officially made in writing or orally. So if I can convince you that the anti-competitive behavior that we're seeing here is problematic, what do we do about it? One solution might be to take a note again from free market economics and say, well, if it turns out that the rate, this doubly ASCAP rate that Universal and Sony are extracting from Pandora is super competitive, just let the market do its job, and we'll get the rate back down eventually to where it's supposed to be. The problem with this, I argue, is that that works if you have a market with working structural competition. Otherwise, it doesn't. The other possible solution would be antitrust. But I argue throughout the paper that antitrust is impotent in this context for a number of reasons. One, and pretty importantly, is the types of anti-competitive behavior that we're seeing in this context, parallel pricing and tacit collusion. Neither of these are violations of the Sherman Act, right? So, or the Robinson-Patman Act, for that matter, the Clayton Act. So they don't actually violate any of the antitrust laws. They're concerning, but they don't rise to the level of antitrust violations under Sherman Act 1 or 2. Merger review, which is another usually effective tool that antitrust can use, also doesn't work here, partly because there's such a history of non-intervention on the part of the DOJ and the FTC here, but also given the mandate under merger review, which is, don't allow mergers if they're going to make the situation worse. Well, when we went from 4 major publishers to 3 major publishers, it didn't make the situation worse. The situation was already pretty crappy, so it just continued to be crappy, but it wasn't worse, right? So merger review couldn't, was rather impotent in that situation as well. Consent decrees, as I mentioned, this is the big hammer that antitrust can usually use. We've got consent decrees. ASCAP operates under it, but the individual publishers don't if they're withdrawing their content, right? So now we've got this weird paradoxical situation where the individual publishers who are withdrawing are actually causing more concerning anti-competitive behavior than the collectives who are being governed by the consent decrees. Antitrust also plays a reduced role in highly regulated areas where we get regulatory deferral. In IP in particular, where the very nature of IP rights tends to cut against what antitrust is going for with the granting of its limited time monopolies. And the situation of music in particular, where we've got goods, music, that are arguably complements and not substitutes. We've got network effects, not only in technology, but in the content itself. I talk a bit in the paper about these interesting studies on how people like the music that they think other people like, so we've got this kind of complicating factor and a two-sided market with the producers, distributors, and users. So instead I propose that what we can use, since the free market solution won't work, antitrust is impotent in this for the reasons I've just described, is a type of regulation that penalizes a lack of competition. For those who've seen various drafts of this, have been playing around with how to word that, the terminology. I'm very open to thoughts, but the idea here being that we take the existing compulsory licenses that we have in copyright. They're currently circumventable, 114, 115. We make them mandatory, like we already have with 109 and 111. This means you can't actually circumvent them at will and go private. We establish one as well for the public performance rights for musical compositions. And then we put a petition process in place. But you can circumvent them if you can show robust competition in the marketplace. We have some precedent for this. Actually, at wholesale electricity, FERC has a process that's very, very similar to this, where if a utility, they need to operate under the particular statute, you need those terms and that pricing, but if they want to engage in private ordering in a particular region, they petition to show competition in that region, and then they can act. So this is the idea behind where I'm going for this punitive regulation, or this regulatory backdrop for competition. There are some cons here, of course. Not only are you increasing the cost of private ordering through the petition process, but you're moving us from a Title 15 to a Title 17 situation. Opens up for regulatory gaming, certainly opens up for lobbying. Also, price setting is just not favored generally. Although I would push back and say if this works, and it really does discourage consolidation of market power so that people can engage in private ordering, we might not have to be operating into the price setting regime very long. But the pros are that this will actually check anti-competitive behavior where antitrust cannot, and can protect artists where they otherwise wouldn't be protected. The real takeaway from this is that regulation can, contrary to conventional wisdom, be used to maintain an open market and to keep powerful incumbents from acting anti-competitively where our more traditional tools don't work. I think this is especially applicable, for example, in some of the contemporary debates like net neutrality, which can be thought of as essentially a debate between whether antitrust or regulation is the best means of ensuring competition in the internet broadband space. So I'm looking at the time, I'm going to stop because I'm really looking forward to thoughts and suggestions from you guys. Thanks.
So you start off by framing your paper as withdrawal from the collectives. But how is that different from Sony and Universal seeing themselves as a better collective? So you're moving from one collective to another one. So obviously there are some definitional issues. There are also some fairness concern that you mentioned. But how would you look at it differently?
The big consequence difference I see is the adverse selection effects of Sony and Universal becoming their own collectives. That is that ASCAP currently has Sony, Universal, and then a smattering of other smaller, either individual songwriters or smaller publishing companies, sort of inconsequential but smaller. When Sony and Universal, for example, withdraw just their digital rights, that's a huge chunk of the revenue that would otherwise be coming into ASCAP, who collects a percentage of the royalties that they collect on. But the overhead more or less remains the same because they're still handling all of the analog side of things, which is where the real cost-intensive stuff comes in. So we see, ultimately, lower pro rata payouts for those smaller members. And it might be that over time it would resolve itself and the smaller members would form their own collectives that had smaller overhead. But as it was proposed, if they just withdrew their digital, leaving their analog behind, they're leaving a huge overhead cost, but taking most of the revenues with them. It's an awfully convenient separate collective for them to have. Hey.
Great talk. I really enjoyed it. I guess just to understand what you mean when you say that you have a kind of compulsory license scheme with a petition to opt out, right? The current 115 license can be bargained around, so you can go to Harry Fox and set that up instead of using the 115 license directly. But it sort of remains as open as a possibility, and anybody who wants to do a cover could, in theory, use the 115 system directly, right? Right. And so, when you're talking about petitioning, sort of petition to opt out, you mean a situation in which instead of the current 115 license, somebody could petition to say, I no longer want to have people have the opportunity to use the 115 compulsory license. I want to be exempt from that process and be able to negotiate on the open market for covers of my song, for which I might get more money. Right. So I'm just wondering whether that's what you mean when you say petition.
It's not, but I think that's a good thing to clarify and also to think about. I was thinking of it on the other end, so just using 115 as an example, so that the idea would be making 115 mandatory, so you can't go around it and talk to Harry Fox even. It's just, here's 115. If you want to do a cover of a song, it costs so many cents per thing, and it is what it is. If you don't want that, I was thinking of this from the perspective of the person seeking the license, not the licensee, not the licensor. If you're seeking the license and you want to negotiate with a particular publisher because you're going to cover a bunch of songs and you think you can work out a better rate, you can only do that if you can show that it's a competitive marketplace, so that we can avoid the opportunity for anti-competitive behavior. But I obviously should give some more thought to the licensor's perspective. I wasn't going to allow the licensors, in other words, to opt out of this and say, well, I actually, now that I've shown competition, I can withdraw from this and not license my piece, or require people to license the piece through me. If that makes sense.
It does, although I thought maybe what's happening with Sony Universal in the ASCAP case is that they were trying to avoid even the opportunity for anybody to go through ASCAP and get the rate court set terms for the license, right?
That's right.
And whereas with 115, you can't avoid the possibility that a licensee could get those, but you still have the ability to private bargain if there's something else that both parties think is better than the terms set by, in that case,
I think that's right. 115 is less concerning in that way than the sort of public performance of compositions that I'm thinking about, where Sony and Universal will have the ability to, once they withdraw from ASCAP, actually deny license for their content altogether.
Yeah, quite different.
I'm going to separate that out. Yeah, it's very different. Thank you. Matt?
how significant is the antitrust exemption in webcasting for this? Because a lot of what you describe in your paper, you're like, well, antitrust can't do anything about it. And I'm like, you know, with just a shade more evidence, this looks like a pretty solid antitrust case.
Well, but I think that shaded evidence is where the meat of this is, right? Because you're right, if we move from tacit collusion to explicit collusion, we might be able to have a case. The argument I'm making here is we don't. We only have tacit collusion. And it could get worse. It could become a tacit collusion like.
And they collude with immunity.
Yes.
I mean, that seems to be a structural problem.
Yeah, and the meat of the paper is really that is it. We don't have structural competition in an industry with a mere 3 entities where 2 of them hold approximately 66% of the content. And so a lot of these tools that we would traditionally use, whether they be free market economics or antitrust, don't work. The market won't respond the way it's supposed to.
I guess my question is, if you look at other industries that are highly concentrated like this, the industry players are very careful when they sit down together, and when they're not careful, they get in huge sorts of trouble. Publishers found out in the Apple eBooks case. But in the music industry, we have a special room where they sit around and they talk about whatever they talk about, and they collude for the strategy that is essentially the same. How are we going to kill Pandora? And it occurs to me as an alternative, like maybe that's the problem.
Yes, and I have had some people point out that one of the things that probably should be emphasized further in this paper is the sort of root problems within the industry here. And I had added, like, for example, it's not purely a hypothetical when I say that we could move beyond parallel pricing and tacit collusion to actually have full-on barriers to entry. If Sony and Universal pull their content to just say no one can license it except our favored entity or our own entity, it wouldn't be that different than what they did with AudioNet or PressPlay in the early 2000s, right? It didn't end up working out, but they have the potential to say there will be no successful streaming service except the one that we christen, and it's this one, right? And so I'm trying to beef up that part a little bit too. Thanks. Okay.
So when I read your paper, I thought, who out there could do some worthy regulation? So the idea of having regulation is an appealing idea. I think you make a pretty good case for it, but before we say, oh, let's go that route, the question is who can do it? So I don't think the Copyright Office, for example, is well situated for being able to do with that kind of market power type of problem. And they don't have economic expertise. They don't know anything really about the industry. The report that they did about music licensing was not exactly embraced warmly. And I didn't actually see any reference to it in your paper, and I was a little bit surprised.
I do have it in now. I don't know which draft you have, but yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that actually seemed to be, and if you're going to say, well, where is their institutional competence to kind of like write this particular thing that's kind of off balance? And I don't know who it is. I would probably trust the Federal Trade Commission over others, but they probably have to get some congressional delegation of authority to kind of facilitate structural competition. I think it's not within the bounds of the Federal Communications Commission, although the FCC is in some sense better situated because they've been dealing with people with big market power issues for a really long time. So I think the paper might want to do, and the CRB is not obviously in the position to do that because it's really an adjudicated body rather than a regulatory agency. But I found the paper, I needed to know where would that regulatory authority go to, and why would this entity be the kind of the proper place to do it? And I think unless you have an answer to that question, it's kind of hard to make the case as strong as you want it to be.
That's a really good point. And it's definitely been the hardest part, the sticking point here. Like you said originally, the CRB has no particular authority, and certainly Copyright Office doesn't have the expertise to be the ones who would set this up. In order to propose this regulation as cost-effective and doable, it would be nice to be able to say, oh, I'm sure the Copyright Office can handle it. I don't know. I'm going to come back to you on that because I have a couple of other ideas. I was thinking FCC just because of what they've been doing in net neutrality, but there's problems with that as well. So
well, it's, you know, Tim Wu wrote about copyright's communications policy.
Right.
Maybe it's good to go back and reread that paper and see whether he has some suggestions.